I'm a 24-year-old guy, and a few weeks ago, I found out something that made my entire childhood finally make sense. Something that explained why I always felt like an outsider in my own family. I was adopted, but not out of love, not because my parents wanted me. I was a last-ditch attempt to fix their failing marriage, a desperate move to glue together something that was already breaking apart. Growing up, I always felt like something was off. My parents weren't cruel, but they weren't warm either. They provided for me. Sure, but in a detached, almost mechanical way. There were no bedtime stories, no family traditions, no real connection. They took care of my needs like they were checking off a to-do list. When they fought, which was often, I became invisible. They'd ignore me for days, lost in their own drama, only acknowledging my existence when they needed to play happy family in front of relatives or friends. When I was 10, my parents had a biological son. Suddenly, everything changed. My little brother was adored from the moment he was born. The love and affection I had spent years craving were effortlessly showered on him. My parents, who had always been distant with me, became doting and affectionate parents with him. They played with him, spoiled him, took endless pictures of him, while I became an afterthought. If I needed something, I had to remind them multiple times. But when it came to him, they anticipated his needs before he even had to ask. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe all parents were just more excited about their younger kids. Maybe I just needed to try harder. But as I got older, the difference became impossible to ignore. When I achieved something, they barely acknowledged it. When he did something as small as drawing a scribble, it was framed and hung on the wall. I remember the first time I confronted them about it. I was 16, old enough to notice the clear favoritism. I asked them why they treated me so differently, why they didn't care about my achievements the way they did his. My mother scoffed, and my father told me I was being dramatic, ungrateful even. That was the moment I realized they were never going to change. So I made a plan. I studied harder than ever, got a scholarship, and moved out the moment I turned 18. After that, I kept my distance. I didn't cut them off completely, but I kept my interactions minimal. No weekend visits, no long phone calls, just the occasional message out of obligation. They didn't seem to mind. If anything, they seemed relieved that they didn't have to pretend anymore. For years, I thought that was it, that I had quietly faded out of their lives. Until a few weeks ago, when out of nowhere they reached out, saying they needed to have a serious conversation. Something about their tone made me curious, so I agreed to meet. The moment I saw them, I knew something was wrong. They looked tired, stressed. The usual forced politeness was gone. My mother barely waited for me to sit down before blurting it out. They were getting a divorce. I didn't react. I had seen it coming for years. But what she said next made my blood run cold. Since our marriage is over, we see no reason to keep a relationship with you. I blinked, not sure if I had heard her right. She continued, completely unfazed. We tried, but it never felt natural. Now that we're separating, we don't have to pretend anymore. I sat there, stunned. My father, who had been quiet up until that point, added, "You're an adult now, so you'll be fine." Like I was some distant relative they were cutting out, not their son. Then came the final blow. My mother sighed, as if she was discussing something mildly inconvenient. "Since we won't be in touch anymore, we think it's only fair that you repay us for raising you." I almost laughed, thinking it was some kind of sick joke, but their faces were dead serious. "For what?" I finally asked. "For everything," my father said. "Food, school, housing, all of it. We spent a lot of money on you, and since we're going through a divorce, finances are tight. It's only fair." I stared at them, waiting for some sign that this was a test, a prank, anything, but no. They genuinely believed I owed them for being their child. I took a deep breath, feeling the last remnants of any attachment I had to them dissolve. Then I said the only thing that felt right. "Ask your real son for the money." My mother's face twisted in anger. "Don't be ridiculous. He's still young. He has a future ahead of him. And I don't." Silence. It was all the confirmation I needed. I stood up, grabbed my coat, and walked out. As I reached the door, I heard my mother's voice, sharp and final. "If you can't help us financially, we have no reason to speak to you." "Works for me," I said without looking back. That night, I blocked their numbers. Whatever tiny hope I had that they cared about me was gone. I had always been a placeholder, a failed experiment, and now that they had no use for me, they were discarding me like I never mattered. And for the first time in my life, I truly felt free. A few days after cutting ties with my parents, my phone lit up with a series of messages from my younger brother. At first I ignored them, but he kept sending more, each one angrier than the last. He called me selfish, accused me of abandoning our parents when they needed me the most. They had told him that I was ungrateful, that after everything they had done for me, I had turned my back on them over a little disagreement. It was obvious they had fed him a completely different version of what happened. In their story, I wasn't the neglected child they discarded. I was the villain who used them, and then walked away. I didn't bother responding. There was no point arguing with a 14-year-old who only knew what they had told him. Then came the guilt tripping. My mother left a voicemail, her voice strained but steady. "We raised you, and this is how you repay us." It was like she was reading from a script, carefully placing the blame on me while ignoring everything they had done. My father didn't call. He never did. He always let her do the talking, the convincing, the emotional manipulation. I didn't reply. I didn't even listen to the whole message. Instead, I went to see a couple of close friends. They already knew most of my story, but when I told them what happened, they were furious. One of them scoffed at the idea that I owed my parents anything. They used you like a prop for their marriage, and now they want a refund. Another pointed out that if they truly saw me as their child, they wouldn't be trying to make me pay for my own upbringing. I knew they were right, but it still felt good to hear it out loud. Then a cousin reached out. He was one of the few family members I actually liked, and he wasted no time in telling me what my parents were saying behind my back. According to them, I had bled them dry, using them for money before cutting them off. They were painting me as some kind of gold digger, someone who took advantage of their kindness, and then left as soon as I didn't need them anymore. That part actually made me laugh. We were never wealthy. If anything, they had barely supported me. I put myself through college with scholarships and part-time jobs, and most of the time, they acted like even that was a burden on them. My cousin knew the truth, which was why he was warning me. He said some of our extended family were already taking sides, and I should be prepared. He wasn't wrong. A few days later, an aunt messaged me, urging me to at least hear them out. She went on about how they were still my parents, how family should stick together. I knew she meant well, but she didn't get it. This wasn't about a simple misunderstanding or a grudge. This was years of being treated like an outsider, of being made to feel like I was only there to serve a purpose. I wasn't going back just because it made things easier for everyone else. I blocked my parents on everything. I wasn't going to give them another chance to manipulate me. The only person I left unblocked was my cousin, just in case I needed updates. Then, my brother reached out again. This time his tone was different. He wasn't angry anymore. He said he had been thinking about what happened, and that maybe our parents weren't telling him the full truth. He admitted that he had seen the way they treated me growing up, and that deep down, he always knew something was off. But he was still a kid, still living under their roof, and he didn't know what to do. That was the first time I hesitated. I didn't hate my brother. He wasn't the problem. But keeping in touch with him meant keeping a line open to my parents, and I wasn't sure if I was willing to do that. I told him I needed time to think about it. Not long after that, my mother tried a new tactic. She sent an email, a complete shift from her last message. This time she claimed they missed me, that they never wanted things to end this way. "We just want to talk," she wrote. As if she hadn't told me I was no longer part of the family days earlier. I didn't respond. I had seen this before. The switch from anger to false kindness when they realized their usual methods weren't working. I wasn't falling for it. Then my cousin sent another message. My parents were telling people I stole from them. The story kept changing, but this was the worst one yet. Now, instead of just being ungrateful, I was a thief. I didn't think they could sink lower, but they always found a way. It all came to a head at a family gathering I hadn't even planned to attend. I was there for a completely unrelated reason, when a distant uncle pulled me aside. He wasted no time accusing me of taking money and abandoning my parents. He was loud enough that others started paying attention. So I set the record straight. I told him, and everyone else within earshot, exactly what happened. How my parents admitted they never wanted me. How they demanded I pay them back for raising me. How they were now spreading lies to save face. Some people looked shocked. Others looked uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact like they suddenly regretted bringing it up. By the end of it, the room was mixed. A few relatives started questioning my parents, but most were hesitant to pick a side, unsure of what to believe. My cousin messaged me later, saying a few family members had already started distancing themselves from my parents after hearing the truth. It wasn't much, but it was something. A few weeks after the family drama exploded, I woke up to an email that made me do a double take. It was from a lawyer, someone I had never heard of, claiming to represent my parents. They were demanding repayment for the cost of raising me, complete with a breakdown of expenses. At first I thought it was some kind of prank, but no, they were serious. The email listed everything from housing to food, even emotional labor, whatever that meant. The total? Some vague amount that they clearly made up on the spot, since no lawyer would take such a ridiculous claim seriously. I forwarded the email to a friend of mine who works in law. His response came almost instantly. "This is ridiculous. They have no case." He explained that parents cannot legally bill their children for raising them. The whole thing was laughable. Instead of ignoring it completely, I decided to respond in the most petty way possible. A few days later, my cousin messaged me, clearly enjoying himself. He had leaked the lawsuit attempt to the family group chat, and the reactions were exactly what I expected. A few days later, my cousin messaged me, clearly enjoying himself. He had leaked the lawsuit attempt to the family group chat, and the reactions were exactly what I expected. My parents were getting roasted. People were openly calling them out, asking if they had lost their minds. Some were making jokes about sending their own kids invoices, while others flat out told them they were embarrassing themselves. But there was one thing that stood out. My younger brother, who had been messaging me just days before, had suddenly gone silent. I sent him a quick message, just a simple hey. No response. I reached out to my cousin, who as usual had all the inside information. He told me my parents had found out that my brother had been talking to me, and they were not happy. They had given him an ultimatum: either he cut contact with me completely, or they would make his life miserable. That included taking away his phone, restricting his internet access, and most importantly, cutting off any financial support for things like school trips and activities. It didn't take long for my brother to cave. That night he sent me a single message: "I can't talk to you anymore. Sorry." I didn't respond. I knew he was just a kid. He was stuck under their roof, and I couldn't expect him to stand up to them. But it still hit harder than I thought it would. Meanwhile, the lawsuit attempt completely backfired. The moment their lawyer actually looked into the case, he dropped them. My cousin overheard that my parents had been told, in no uncertain terms, that they had zero legal grounds. They had wasted their time and money for nothing. Not that it stopped them. Since they couldn't get to me directly, they did the next best thing: public humiliation. They took to Facebook, writing a long dramatic post about how their adopted child had betrayed them after everything they had done for me. They called me selfish, ungrateful, a failure. The usual. Normally I wouldn't have cared. But my cousin came through with something unexpected. A former family friend had reached out, someone who had known my parents for years but had distanced themselves recently. They told my cousin something that confirmed what I had always suspected. My parents had been telling people for years that adopting me was a mistake. They never said it to my face, but behind closed doors they had been open about it. To them, I wasn't their son. I was an obligation they regretted. It wasn't even shocking at this point. It just solidified my decision. They weren't my family. They never were. A few days later, my cousin sent me one last screenshot. Under my parents' Facebook rant, multiple relatives had jumped in, not to defend them, but to call them out. Some asked why they were lying. Others flat out told them they were ashamed to be related to them. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had actually won. You said, a few weeks passed without any direct contact from my parents. I thought maybe they had finally given up. Then my cousin sent me screenshots from a private family chat. My parents were claiming they only have one child now. They had completely erased me, acting as if I never existed. It didn't stop there. My younger brother made a public post on social media, calling himself an only child and thanking his parents for always being there for him. It was carefully worded, just vague enough to sound normal to outsiders but obvious enough for anyone who knew the situation. Some relatives, confused by what they were seeing, reached out to me directly. They asked if something had happened, if this was true. I kept it simple. I told them that my parents had disowned me because I refused to give them money. Some were horrified, saying they had no idea things were this bad. Others stayed neutral, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to get involved. Then, after weeks of silence, my mother sent me one last message. It was short, direct, and probably the cruelest thing she had ever said to me. "I should have known you were a mistake from the beginning." That same day my father called, not to apologize, not to make things right. He spoke in the same calm, controlled tone he always used when trying to manipulate people. He said this could have all been avoided if I had just helped them when they asked. That I was the one who turned this into something ugly. I didn't respond. I let him talk for a while, then ended the call without saying a word. Later, my cousin called with more news. My parents were taking things even further. They were trying to remove my name from family records, birth certificates, legal documents, anything they had control over. They wanted to erase any official proof that I was ever part of their lives. Then came the final threat. My mother sent a message, warning that if I didn't apologize and send them the money they originally demanded, they would legally disown me. I told my cousin to let them do whatever they wanted. That's when their stories changed again. They started telling people that they had saved me from a terrible life, that they had given me everything and I had repaid them with betrayal. They twisted every detail, making themselves look like victims. My brother, who had stayed mostly quiet since his last message, reached out again. This time, his tone was different. He called me selfish. He told me I had abandoned our parents, that they had done nothing wrong. It was obvious my parents had been feeding him lies, and he had finally given in. The last straw came when my parents demanded that I return childhood gifts. It was a ridiculous request, but I understood what they were doing. They wanted to rewrite history, to erase any sign that I had ever been a part of their lives. I didn't respond. Instead, I blocked them permanently, ensuring there was no way for them to ever contact me again. A few days later, my cousin told me that more family members were starting to question my parents' actions. Some were realizing the truth, slowly distancing themselves from them. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was enough. I had finally cut them out of my life, and for the first time, I truly felt free. Work had been my escape from all of this. No drama, no messages, just a place where I could focus and not think about my parents' nonsense. That lasted until my manager pulled me aside one morning, looking uncomfortable. Someone had called the office, claiming I was a dangerous and ungrateful person who had cut off their family for no reason. The moment I heard that, I knew exactly who was behind it. My manager reassured me that they didn't take the call seriously. but they wanted me to be aware of what was happening. They even joked about how some people have way too much time on their hands. But I wasn't laughing. This was a new level of petty even for my parents. A few days later, they escalated. This time, it was my father. He called the office again. This time, claiming that I had stolen from them, that I was a dishonest person who couldn't be trusted. He didn't have any proof, of course, but that didn't stop him from trying. Thankfully, my boss saw right through it and warned me that if it continued, they would document everything in case I wanted to take legal action. I had already blocked my parents, but their attempts to harass me were getting worse, so I contacted a lawyer to see what my options were. The lawyer told me I could send a cease and desist letter to warn them legally, and if they continued, I could file for harassment. I wasn't sure I wanted to take it that far, but knowing I had a legal route gave me some peace of mind. Then, my younger brother messaged me again. This time it wasn't an apology, it was smug. He told me, maybe if you weren't such a bad person, this wouldn't be happening. It was obvious he had been completely sucked into my parents' version of events. I didn't reply, there was nothing left to say. Meanwhile, my cousin kept me updated on the growing mess. My parents were now reaching out to other relatives, telling them to cut ties with me. Some ignored them, others took their side, but the ones who mattered, people who actually knew the truth, weren't buying it. Then came the online posts. My mother started making vague but aggressive statements on social media about toxic people and ungrateful children. She never mentioned me by name, but it was clear who she was talking about. She wanted attention, sympathy, people to tell her she was a good mother who didn't deserve this. Surprisingly, a distant aunt, someone who had previously stayed neutral, reached out. She said she was disgusted by what my parents were doing and that she wanted to support me. However she could. She had always suspected there was something wrong with the way they treated me but never realized how bad it was. It wasn't much, but knowing at least one more family member saw the truth helped. Then, out of nowhere, my younger brother sent another message. This time, it was an apology. It seemed genuine, but something felt off. Against my better judgment, I responded, keeping it short but civil. Within minutes, I got confirmation of my suspicion. My cousin sent me a screenshot. My brother had immediately sent my response to my parents. That was it. I blocked him. I had been trying to hold on to some form of connection with him, but it was clear he couldn't be trusted. Maybe he was being manipulated. Maybe he genuinely believed everything they told him. But either way, I was done. Then my parents tried something new. They started messaging my friends. I found out when a longtime friend sent me a screenshot. My mother had reached out to them, saying she was worried about me and wanted them to convince me to come back to the family. Most of my friends ignored it, but one, someone I had known for years, started acting distant. When I confronted them, they said they weren't sure who to believe. That stung more than I expected, to stop more interference. I made all my social media private and warned my close friends about what was happening. If my parents wanted to spread lies, they weren't going to use my life as their playground. In the end, I took my lawyer's advice. I moved forward with a cease and desist letter. If they continued, I'd have proof to take legal action. They wanted to control me, but I wasn't giving them another chance. The cease and desist letter was sent. My lawyer made it clear that if my parents continued to harass me, whether through calls, messages, or trying to interfere with my life, I would take legal action. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had taken control of the situation. It didn't take long for my mother to respond. Instead of staying quiet or backing off, she sent an email that was almost comically unhinged. She called me a traitor, said I had turned my back on the people who gave me everything, and ended it with, "I hope you rot alone." The sheer bitterness in her words made it clear. She wasn't upset because she missed me. She was furious because she had lost control over me. My father followed up with a string of aggressive voicemails, each one angrier than the last. He insisted that I didn't get to cut them out like this, as if I owed them my presence in their lives. He warned that I was making a mistake and that I would regret this in the future. I didn't listen to all of them. I just saved them as evidence and moved on. Meanwhile, my cousin kept me updated on the growing disaster in the family group chat. My parents were ranting about how they would take me down legally, as if they hadn't already embarrassed themselves with their failed lawsuit attempt. Some relatives still supported them, but many were starting to distance themselves, realizing just how unhinged they had become. Then, in true manipulative fashion, my mother switched tactics. She sent another email, this time pretending to be remorseful. "We can fix this if you just come home," she wrote, as if she hadn't told me to rot alone just days before. I didn't respond. I had seen this pattern my whole life. Rage, then guilt-tripping, then fake kindness when nothing else worked. I wasn't falling for it. More and more family members started pulling away from them. The distant aunt who had supported me finally spoke up in the group chat. She exposed my parents' lies, revealing things even I didn't know about how they had always treated me like an outsider. She asked why they were trying so hard to destroy my life when they were the ones who pushed me away. My parents had no response. Desperate for control, they made another empty legal threat. This time, they claimed they would sue me for defamation. My lawyer laughed when I told him. They had no case. They knew it, but they wanted to scare me into silence. It didn't work. Then came the final message from my younger brother. It was short, just one sentence. "Mom and Dad said you are dead to us now." I read it once, then deleted it. No response. No reaction. I was done. For the first time, I didn't feel angry or sad. I felt free. But my mother wasn't done humiliating herself. She made a dramatic post on social media about losing a son, clearly expecting sympathy. She painted herself as the heartbroken mother who had done everything for an ungrateful child. But instead of support, people started asking questions. Why would a parent disown their child over money? Why was she making this public instead of trying to fix things privately? Realizing that the response wasn't what she had hoped for, she deleted the post. With the cease and desist in place and no further attempts at contact, I finally felt like I could move on. My parents had lost their grip on me. They had tried to control me through guilt, through threats, through manipulation, and none of it worked. They had erased me from their lives, and I was more than happy to return the favor. A few weeks of silence had passed. No more calls, no more emails, no more ridiculous social media posts. I thought maybe, just maybe, my parents had finally given up. Then my cousin sent me a screenshot. My parents were ranting about how they should sue me, but since their last attempt had failed, I knew it was just another empty threat. They were demanding money for wasted years and investment losses since they had adopted me. It was the most desperate thing they had done yet. Apparently, because I had cut contact and refused to give them money, they believed they were entitled to compensation. As if raising a child, something they chose to do, was a business investment that had gone bad. I forwarded the letter to my lawyer. His response was immediate. This was laughable. They had no case. No court would take their claim seriously. Still, to put an official stop to it, he filed a formal response, shutting it down properly before they could try anything else. Of course, my mother couldn't let it end there. She ran straight to social media, making a dramatic post about how they were forced to take legal action against their own son because he had abandoned them. The post was long, emotional, and filled with exaggerations. She made it sound like they had been the perfect parents, that I had simply discarded them without reason. This time, people weren't buying it. More family members reached out, horrified that they had actually taken things this far. Some who had previously tried to stay neutral finally made a decision. They cut ties with my parents completely. They told my cousin they couldn't believe the lengths my parents were going to just to punish me for walking away. And then, there was my younger brother. He had gone from openly insulting me to radio silence. No messages, no vague social media posts, nothing. Maybe he had finally realized just how far our parents were willing to go. Maybe he was rethinking everything. Or maybe he was just waiting for things to settle down. Either way, I didn't reach out. Then came the real confirmation of everything I had always suspected. A distant uncle, someone I had barely spoken to in years, reached out through my cousin. He admitted that, for as long as he could remember, my parents had treated me more like an experiment than a son. They never talked about me with love or pride. They spoke about me as if I was an obligation, something they had to deal with rather than someone they wanted in their lives. And if I needed more proof, my cousin had it. He sent me a recording from a family gathering where my mother had a complete meltdown. She cried about how she was the victim in all of this, how she had done everything for me, and how I had ruined their lives by turning against them. But she wasn't getting sympathy. The recording caught another relative asking her point blank why she thought suing her own son was justified. She didn't have an answer. Their story kept changing. First I was ungrateful, now I was a troubled child who had made their lives miserable. They were grasping at anything, trying to twist the narrative in their favor. But none of it mattered. A few weeks after the lawsuit was filed, their own lawyer dropped the case. It was obvious they had no legal standing. It was over. That didn't stop my father from trying one last time. He sent a final message. It was short but filled with bitterness. "You'll regret this when you're alone, and we are gone." I didn't even hesitate. I blocked him. My mother, seeing that they had completely lost, sent one last email. It wasn't angry, or desperate, or demanding. It was weak. A simple plea to move forward and forget all this. I didn't respond. My lawyer updated the cease and desist, making sure there was no loophole left for them to try again. If they reached out in any way, I could take legal action immediately. And just like that, it was done. No more legal threats. No more manipulation. No more harassment. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe. They had tried everything, guilt, lies, threats, even the legal system, to control me. And none of it had worked. They had erased me from their lives, and now I was finally doing the same. The fallout from the lawsuit was worse for my parents than it was for me. After their failed attempt to sue me for financial damages became known, more family members cut ties with them. Some had tried to stay neutral, but when they realized how far my parents were willing to go just to punish me, they wanted nothing to do with them. The family group chat had gone quiet. My parents, once loud and self-righteous, had stopped posting updates. Then, my cousin sent me more news. My mother's social circle, friends she had known for years, was pulling away. Word had spread about everything she had done, from trying to erase me from the family to the ridiculous lawsuit. Some of these women had children of their own, and they couldn't stomach the idea of someone suing their own kid out of spite. My mother wasn't just losing family support, she was losing the image she had carefully built for herself. Out of nowhere, my younger brother messaged me again. It wasn't hostile this time. His words were uncertain. I don't know what to believe anymore. It was the first real crack in the wall. For months he had defended them, attacked me, played into their lies, but now, he wasn't so sure. Then, my cousin dropped another bombshell. My parents were struggling financially. They weren't as well off as they liked to pretend. The entire reason they had tried to manipulate me into giving them money was because they needed it. My father's job wasn't as stable as he made it seem, and my mother had been overspending for years. The lawsuit wasn't just about punishing me, it was their last attempt at squeezing money out of me to keep themselves afloat. Then came the biggest shock of all. A former family friend reached out to my cousin and revealed something I hadn't expected. My father's workplace had found out about the lawsuit. Apparently, someone had shared the details, and it was not a good look. He worked in a field where reputation mattered, and suing his own son for investment losses wasn't exactly something his employer wanted attached to their company. The details were vague, but from what I was told, he was facing some serious consequences at work. Desperate to save face, my parents switched tactics again. They started telling people they forgave me, as if they were the bigger people, choosing to be gracious after everything I had done to them. No apologies, no acknowledgement of their actions, just a calculated move to make themselves look like the victims who were willing to be merciful. Then, the last person I expected to take a stand finally did. The previously neutral aunt, who had tried to keep the peace, officially cut ties with them. She told them directly that she wanted nothing to do with them anymore. She had seen enough. At a family gathering, everything came to a head. My mother had a full public breakdown, crying in front of everyone about how I had betrayed her. She sobbed about how she had done everything for me, how she had loved me, how I had abandoned her after all her sacrifices. But no one comforted her. No one stepped in to take her side. The people who still supported her weren't even there, and the ones who were, they were tired. They had heard it all before. Then, my brother messaged me again. This time, it wasn't uncertain, it was desperate. He finally admitted that our parents had pressured him to take their side, that they had threatened him with everything from financial support to emotional manipulation, that he had been scared of what would happen if he didn't stand with them. And then, for the first time, he said something I never expected to hear. I don't want to end up like them. That was the moment I realized he was starting to see the truth. He wasn't just questioning things, he was afraid of where his life was heading if he kept following their lead. But he was still stuck. He was still young, still living under their roof, still dependent on them. He didn't know what to do. Meanwhile, my parents were now completely isolated. The only people still speaking to them were distant relatives who refused to see the truth. Their closest allies had either cut them off or distanced themselves. They had no power left, no way to manipulate their way back into control. Then came my mother's final attempt. One last email, one last guilt trip. The subject line was simple: when we die, you'll regret everything. I didn't open it. I deleted it without a second thought. With everything finally settling down, I started making plans. A fresh start, a new city, a place where I could move forward without constantly looking over my shoulder. But there was still one loose thread. My brother. He was trapped between two lives. One where he followed in our parents' footsteps, becoming just like them, and one where he broke free, like I did. For now, all I could do was wait and see which one he chose.